up to order itself. And when things get disordered, and the only disorder in the universe is when we deviate from love, then it's kind of like a GPS. The universe knows how to correct itself. It knows how to recalibrate. So I want to talk to you about tonight, about the love, the spirit that is in the cornerstone philosophy of America. I want to talk to you about how we have deviated from that, and I want to talk to you about how we have to get back on track. Now, if we talk about how our country needs a miracle, and that miracles come from love, what are the two categories of that love that we need to focus on? Number one, we need to focus on love of America, and secondly, we need to focus on our love of each other. Now, in order to understand ourselves, we have to understand our history. A lot of times you go to therapy and you talk about your parents, you talk about your grandparents. I know members of particular ethnic groups and so forth want to know the history of the culture, the history going back a long time, because you understand as an individual that you fit into a narrative that did not begin with you. You have inherited certain thought forms, you've inherited certain forces. And so you can't understand yourself very well without understanding how you fit into the larger story through time. But that is true of us as citizens as well. I think a lot of Americans weren't taught as much American history as we might have been, or if we were, we don't quite remember. Only 8 states in America even require civics education. So when it comes to understanding what's happening in our country, I think a large part of the problem is that we're not clear sometimes even what our historical narrative is. And you know, it's like looking at a novel. You can't just open it in the middle. You have to know what the plot is. You have to know what the characters are, what's been happening before. So it's an extremely important time for us to, as citizens, take responsibility for what is happening in our generation, but it's difficult for us to do without a deeper understanding of what has come before. And what has come before in the United States is particularly meaningful to those of us on a spiritual path, because the founding of this country was not just a political unfoldment and move forward for the human race. It was a spiritual and moral movement forward for the human race. Before the founding of this country, Western civilization was under the thrall of a monarchical system. And within that monarchical system, it was called the ancient regime, the social system was predicated on the idea, and you and I were taught as kids about the divine right of kings, that God gave power to the king or the queen. And then the king or queen shared their power with their cronies, a few people who were called the aristocracy. Now, the aristocracy was entitled. They were entitled to own the land. They were entitled to create wealth. They were entitled to wealth creating opportunities. They were entitled to education. And that was it. Them and only them. So they were allowed the material means to self-actualize. They were allowed the material means to spread their wings and become on this planet anything that was their God-given potential. What's operative here is that no one else was. And with the founding of this country, that entire paradigm was turned on its ear. That entire paradigm, in a very radical way. It was radical then, almost 250 years ago, and it's radical today. It was the idea not that God gave power to a king or queen to just be capriciously lent to us at whim, but rather that God created all men equal, and that God gave all men the inalienable rights to life and to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness, and that government would be instituted in order to secure those liberties, and that government would not have a purpose only of taking care of the king, the queen, and the aristocrats, but that government would be there to also oversee the general welfare. And when you and I were kids, we were taught how important it was. We were taught that people came here for religious freedom. And so religious freedom was also a very important part of all this. The people here could practice any religion or no religion. And there would be a separation of church and state. And what separation of church and state meant that was so enlightened was that it was a protection of the government from religious interference, and equally so, a protection of religion and spirituality from governmental interference. And what does that mean? That means that when Congress is meeting, no priest, minister, rabbi, mufti, imam, or any other religious clergy can come in to our legislative councils like they could in some place like Iran, like the Ayatollah can, and say, you've got to pass this law and you can't pass that one. It also means no policeman's coming in here tonight to tell us to break it up. No policeman can come in here, as they could in other countries, and say, this New Thought stuff and Church of Religious Science and Spirit Centers for Spiritual Living, Course of Miracles and stuff, that's not on the official list. You can't meet. So with that, notice that our founders were not trying to suppress the religious or spiritual conversation. They were protecting the religious and spiritual conversation. Now, these enlightened principles that formed the founding of our country, the men who signed the Declaration of Independence were risking their lives by signing it. Because if the war for independence had been lost by the colonists, all of those men who signed the Declaration would have been executed as traitors by the King of England. So here you have a country established on these extraordinarily enlightened principles that were important because what they posited was the possibility for the material means of self-actualization for everyone. I mean, that's everything we're about, that anything is possible. But it's difficult to say anything is possible to someone who can't afford land, can't get an education, can't make of their external lives that which God might have them make. But, and we all know this is the dichotomy, this is the difficulty out of which America was born. 41 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, which was a majority, were themselves slave owners. So this has been with us from the beginning. It's in our DNA, this tension between, on the one hand, the most enlightened principles that have ever imbued the founding of any nation on earth at its founding, and the fact that we ourselves as a people, as a nation, have often been from the beginning some of the main perpetrators of the transgressions and injustices which violate those very principles. That's been with us from the beginning. It is our historical narrative. It is the narrative not only from our beginning, it is the narrative today, within which every single generation has people whose hearts have been ablaze with the possibilities of democracy, with the recognition of the importance of this covenant to the history of the world, who have struggled, who have sacrificed, in some cases have died, so that this vortex of possibility could exist. And there have been those, every generation, whose basic perspective has been, let's not. Now, this is the deal. If you look at the entire story, if you look at the narrative, over time, we tend to self-correct. So yes, we had slavery, but what do we also have? We had abolition. Yes, we had the denial of rights to women. Women could not own property. Women could not own money. Women could not vote. Guess what else we had? We had the suffrage movement, the established 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, and 2 waves of feminism. We had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South. Oh, yes, we did, but what else did we have? We had the civil rights movement. We had the denial of rights to gay people. But what else did we have? We had the human rights organizations, and we had the marriage equality movement. We had the genocide of the Native American people, and even now, what do we have? We have thousands of people gathered at Standing Rock trying to make right what a people who have been wronged. So the issue in the United States is that many people, particularly our young people, are having a hard time loving America today. They're having a hard time loving America because they see the shadow side. And they see the fact that so many times America doesn't talk about its shadow side, but those of us on a spiritual practice understand you have to atone. You have to see your shadow. You can't do a spiritual bypass about your personal life or about your collective life. But this is the issue. We need to identify the problems in America. Of course we do. But we need to identify with the problem solvers. We need to recognize that America has done some terrible things, but we're not terrible people. But the point is, when America has transgressed, there has been a generation, always, there have been those generations who rose to the occasion. We have slavery, we're going to make it right. We have women denied suffrage, but we're going to make it right. We have segregation, we're going to make it right. What has happened to us as a people, ladies and gentlemen, because we once more, as generations before us have, are facing an assault on democracy itself. Because we have subconsciously reverted to an aristocratic paradigm. We once again, and you can call it an oligarchy, you can call it a plutocracy. The point is, it's not a democracy. When for all intents and purposes, only a few people for all intents and purposes have what should be considered reasonable access to wealth creation opportunity, to healthcare, to education, and so forth. We are not the first generation to have to deal with forces that would actually undercut democracy itself. Let's just not be the first generation to wimp out on doing what it takes to put this country back on track. We in the spiritual community have our own shadows to look at. What has happened over the last few decades? I'll tell you something. There is no spiritual or religious tradition, any that I've ever read or studied, and I've been a deep student of these issues, gives anyone a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. So this idea, I hear people say, oh, well, I just don't want to have anything to do with politics because it's too toxic. Can we talk for a second? Anything that our crowd touches is transformed. Where do you think all those yoga mats come from? Our crowd. Where do you think all those mindfulness things come from? Our crowd. So you're telling me that we don't go into politics because it's too toxic? That's just because we haven't been there yet. That if you do not take part in the collective, if we do not take part in our collective experience, then we are actually circling in such a way that we are not being liberated, we're being co-opted. That's not liberation. It's completely being co-opted if you think that your liberation only has to do with you. The issue is for us to extend those things which we have learned. And so our question now is, what does it mean to really stand on love today? Because if love is only a personal conversation, then that's not ultimately the love that will save the world. The love that will save the world is not just love for your children or my children. The love that will save the world is children for the other side of town and children on the other side of the world. And the love that will save the world today is not just love for our home. The love that will save the world is a love which recognizes that the earth on which we stand is everybody's home. Many years ago, I was dancing it was a solstice, and I was dancing under the moon, and I had on my cut velvet scarf, and I was all about the goddess. And I thought, oh my God, Marianne, she wants more than this from you. you think she is this? And I thought about my mother, and how when I was growing up, my mother was a very traditional housewife, and her whole life was my father, my sister, my brother, and me, and our home. This was what she thought taking care of your children and taking care of your home was the be-all and end-all. And I mistakenly thought my mother didn't get it. And it took me years to know how wrong I was about my mother. Because I, wanted to go out there and do something important. You learn enough metaphysically, there is no out there. And I realize now that everything my mother said was right. We do have to put taking care of the children first and taking care of home first. We just have to realize that every child on this earth is one of our children, and the earth itself is our home. largest mammalian species that survives and thrives, there is a common anthropological characteristic, and that is the fierce behavior of the adult female of that species when she senses that there is a threat to her cubs. The mama bear, lion, tiger, you come after her cubs, she's coming after you, and she doesn't care if you find her strident or if you think she has anger issues. The adult female hyenas encircle the babies while they're being fed and will not let the adult male hyenas anywhere near the food until the babies have eaten. Surely the women of America could do better than the hyenas. And the women in America, as well as the spiritual communities, have to ask ourselves why we are not. And one of the reasons many are not is that what's happening today has people traumatized. Traumatized. Let me tell you something. We don't have time for you to finish your trauma work before you show up for your country. You think the people who walked across the bridge at Selma were not traumatized? They didn't know they were going to send out the dogs. They didn't know they were going to send out the hoses. They didn't know if they were going to send out the bullets. You think that the women suffragettes who were being force-fed in prison were not anxious? Do you think they didn't have an anxiety disorder? Oh, you have an anxiety disorder. Everybody has an anxiety disorder. Let me tell you something. If given what's happening in this country today, you're not depressed, what is wrong with you? Sometimes the fact that you're depressed is a sign of mental health. The fact that you're upset is a sign of mental health. And the last thing that American women should be falling for is a psychotherapeutic, psychopharmacological, industrial, multi-billion-dollar industrial complex. Yes. Which would have you think that the fact that you're upset means something's wrong with you. American women are upset because we know something's wrong, and it's our time to make it right. We know in our own individual lives, and by the way, just to be very clear, because the topic, we've gone there a little bit. I'm not suggesting that anyone who might be on pharmaceuticals for depression or anxiety go throw them in the trash tonight. And I mean that very seriously because that is a very dangerous thing to do. If anything, in what I say tonight or in the book that I wrote called Tears to Triumph, does move you into that inquiry. This is not something to take care of in any way except through absolute medical supervision. I think it is something for every person in America to know and to realize that the FDA has issued a black box warning that for people 25 years old and younger, antidepressants increase rather than decrease the risk of suicidal ideation. It's a very important topic. We can talk about it more later if you'd like, but I bring it up here simply in the sense that this is not a time for us to be in a fog. This is not a time for us to think that everything's okay, when in fact it's not okay, and it's not a time for us to think, and this began with Freud, this idea that if I'm upset or you're upset, we all go to therapy, and what's happening in your life that has you depressed? It's not just what's happening in your life or your life or your life, it's what's happening in all of our lives. And so many of the things that are affecting us individually are actually a consequence of things that are happening collectively. But what we know spiritually, and this is why we are so important, I think, to the process of the healing of the United States, is that if you have an understanding of how spiritual principles operate in your own individual life, then you can bring them to bear on the larger drama that is occurring. And one of the things that we know is that life is not just about what happens to you. Life is about who you choose to be in the space of what's happening to you. We're not a bunch of victims. What has happened to us that we're so enamored of our own woundedness? And sometimes that's in our community. We should be the biggest grown-ups in the room. We should not be the people sitting out on the side, peripheralizing, like, oh, I don't know, it's just too upsetting. Or I just have my own stuff I need to go through now. No. Pearl Harbor was not convenient. Okay? National catastrophes are not convenient. And ladies and gentlemen, no matter what your political, where you are, on the left, on the right, what we're going through is a little bit of a national catastrophe. Well, the Course in Miracles says miracles derive from conviction. Conviction. Love is fierce. Love is not just kind of namby-pamby. No. Love is fierce. I'll tell you, however, who has conviction? Terrorists. You know, every time there's a terrorist act, whether it's been domestic or international, the American president, no matter who it's been, has always said that this cowardly act will not be tolerated. And I always tilt my head because you can say a lot about these people, but I'm not sure cowardly is a word that he describes it. Because the truth of the matter is hatred has a perverse kind of courage. I can't even imagine a kind of sort of sometimes, when it's convenient, committed terrorist. People who hate. You saw this in Charlottesville. You saw it on 9/11. People who hate, they're serious. And they are willing to do whatever it takes to effectuate their worldview. There aren't more of them than us. Way more lovers in this country and in this world than haters. But the problem is that those who hate with more conviction. I've known a lot of people, and I know I've been one at times, kind of sort of sometimes, when it's convenient, committed to love. We need to be as convicted behind love, as committed behind love, as passionate behind love, as strong behind love, as some people are behind hate. And if we have learned anything in the last few years, it's that you cannot take your democracy for granted. When you look at the great social justice movements in the United States, if you look at abolition, where did abolition come from? It came from the Quakers, where many of the leaders of the suffragette movement were Quakers. Dr. King was a Baptist preacher. This is not an accident that these great movements have come from a religious and a spiritual impulse. Because what the religious and the spiritual impulse gives us is the capacity to own our yes and also to own our no. I read a book by Sue Monk Kidd called The Invention of Wings. And in that book, it's wonderful, isn't it? And in that book, she talks about two women who actually existed called the Grimke sisters. And the Grimke sisters were born to a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. And, if you were born into a slave-owning family and you had any kind of a spiritual awakening and you realized that slavery was evil, you're out. You were out of your family, out of town, out of the state, you're out. And the Grimke sisters were converted to the abolitionist cause by the Quakers. Because the Quakers believe in a universal priesthood of all believers. It's a very new thought type of spirituality, a sense of an inner light within every man, woman, and child. But because it was their religious conviction that there is God's equal light within every man, woman, and child, then slavery would become intolerable. Now, this is the deal. That book made me think a lot about the difference between being anti-slavery and becoming an abolitionist. It was enough, even just to become anti-slavery, to say, I got to get out of South Carolina. I'm not going to live in a slave-owning state. But if you were anti-slavery and you were living, let's say, somewhere in New England or in some other state that did not own slaves, and you thought slavery was wrong, and you thought people who owned slaves were nuts, and you'd never do it, as lovely as that is, that of itself did not move the needle for one slave. But then there's a bridge you cross. A psychological bridge, an emotional bridge, a spiritual bridge from anti-slavery to abolitionist. And that is the bridge that we need to cross today from, I don't agree with it, to not on my watch. We know as spiritual seekers that there is no such thing as a neutral thought. In the Course in Miracles, it says there's no such thing as a neutral thought. Every thought takes you to love or to fear. Every thought takes you and those around you either deeper into love or deeper into fear. Energy itself is not neutral. And every moment we are making a choice. We are making a choice either consciously or we're making a choice unconsciously. With our thoughts and our behavior, do we choose love? And one of the things that we learn as spiritual seekers is if you don't fill your house with light, light means understanding. If you don't wake up in the morning and say, God, use me. If you don't wake up in the morning and say, Spirit, use me, love, use me. Use my hands, use my feet. Use who I am and what I do. Then the energy that you withheld from service to God will be used in service to your neurosis. That's just how it works. So, when Bob Dylan said, you gotta have to serve somebody, it might be the devil, it might be the Lord, you're gonna have to serve somebody. That's very true. Every thought, the thought that is not given to service, not given to love, not given to compassion, not given to forgiveness, will be given to neurosis and to pathology. And all of the great religious systems make it very clear that that's where depression comes from. Depression comes from the fact that when the mind is ordered around love, that is the only way to be happy. It is the only way to be happy. So in a society that tells us things make us happy, and making more money makes us happy, all the things, even in our crowd, all those people that you can make your dreams come true. Our crowd has gotten so into this in the last few years. Manifest your dreams, manifest your dreams. Like that's the top of the spiritual mountain, to manifest your dreams. You know who else manifested his dreams? Adolf Hitler. The fact that you can manifest your dreams is not the spiritual mountaintop. The spiritual mountaintop is that you let love dream through you. It's not where you look at God like an errand boy. I want this, and I want this, and I want this, and I want this. That is not the high spiritual mountaintop. The high spiritual mountaintop is not where you tell the universe what you want it to do for you. The high spiritual mountaintop is when you ask the universe how you could be of service to it. And in national terms, that has been the blessing of this country. The blessing of this country is that we have the vortex of our national consciousness of the American dream. The American dream has never been, you can have what you want, and you can have what you want, and you can have what you want. The American dream is that anybody, if they work hard enough, can have what they want. And the American dream is that is a dream for all humanity. Give me your tired, give me your hungry, give me your poor. Ladies and gentlemen, we are, as you and I speak, in the midst of the dismantling of the American dream, the shutting down of the American dream. And anybody who thinks it couldn't happen here, it is happening. It is happening as we speak. Now, one of the things I talked about earlier was that miracles occur from love. So we have to love not only our country, and like I said, you don't love this country because we've done everything right. You know, some people only want to talk about what America's done right and have no listening for the deep awareness that we must have to atone for the areas where we've gotten it wrong. But then other people only want to talk about what America's done wrong. It's like they didn't know till recently, and now they're all up in arms about it. Right? They just read one book or took one college class, and oh, did you know we're terrible? We've done terrible things. Like, yeah, you're new to this. Right? But the truth of the matter is, people who only want to talk about what we've done wrong, they are as unbalanced, and that is as ignorant a perspective on America as those who only think we've done right. We haven't done everything right, but let me tell you something else. We haven't done everything wrong either. And we're not just this rank, hypocritical country. We are a country in the throes of a greater becoming. And so the fact that we have the terrible, terrible assaults on our democracy right now, including wealth inequality, which is kind of baked into the cake these days. We were in the richest country in the world, so you have 40% of our citizens who can't afford basic rent and food. But even worse than that is that that's not an accident. What's worse than that is that our government, because of the undue influence of money, basically is a handmaiden to the forces that guarantee those patterns of wealth inequality. Because there is so much sucking up of the material resources systematically into the hands of just a few Americans, namely the few Americans who can afford to flood the campaign coffers of our politicians with the money that will keep them in office. And that is the cancer that is underlying all these other cancers. Not only the wealth inequality, the racial injustice in our criminal system, the fact that mass incarceration exists as it does, the fact that even as we speak, we are living through a time of the dismantling of our environmental protections. We now have an Environmental Protection Agency, which was set up by a Republican president, that now it does not exist to protect our environment. It exists to protect the short-term economic profits of fossil fuel companies and chemical companies. It now has gutted the Clean Water Act, gutted the Clean Air Act, has overturned ban on pesticides that every scientist within the Obama administration had said should be banned because of the harm that it knows it does, that we know it does to a developing child's brains. For the women in this room who would like to one day have children, in particular who either have young children or have not had your children yet, please think about what this means. And even today, they're all excited about the success of the EPA because it is deregulating all of the rules on carbon that comes from our cars. Now, California is going to fight this. California is doing what it can, but the point is, as I was saying before, the issue is not that this is happening. The issue is who we are or who we are not in the space of what is happening. But you can't just fight this by having this fight mentality. We must override this with love. But it cannot be a love that doesn't look at what's happening. There's a difference between denial and transcendence. And there's nothing holy about complacency. There's nothing negative about yelling fire if in fact your house is burning down and our democracy is on fire. So now the issue is, how do we do this? Well, I want to tell you a story. It was something that happened for me on Easter. On Easter, I was in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I gave a talk, a Love America talk, the night before Easter, and the morning of Easter, I gave a talk about Jesus. So after the Easter service, I went to lunch with two of the ministers from the church, and one of them her son and one of them her husband. And so in the middle, the son of one had already told me in the car, we've been talking, he was a very intelligent, conservative gentleman, and he told me that he didn't agree with many of my politics, but my talk about Jesus changed his life. So he was this great guy. We had this really good conversation, and these were really great people. Christian, you might know them at the New Thought Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so at lunch, in the middle of lunch, I said, I want to talk about politics. And there was this quiet. And I said, did you vote for Trump? And one man said, yes, ma'am, I did. And the other woman said, I didn't vote for either one. I couldn't vote for either one of them. I didn't vote for either one of them. And the other one said, yes, I did. And the other gentleman, I knew he'd voted for Trump because he had told me in the car. And there was silence, and I said, can you tell me what I'm not saying? What is it I'm not saying? And they all told me something which I've heard from a lot of people, which is, well, we don't like him so much as a man. We get that there's some things, but we like what he's doing for America. Now, it's not an accident that that was Easter morning. Because we had prayed together, we had meditated together. And so we were in a place where we weren't reactive towards each other. And that was only because we had prayed together. It was because we had meditated together that we could hear one another. I heard them, and I like to think that there were some things about which they heard from me too. You know, President Eisenhower, said that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. There are high-minded liberal principles and there are high-minded conservative principles. And at the best, they form this yin and yang, this dance. Nobody has a monopoly on truth. That is a spiritual principle. Nobody has a monopoly on truth. So what we're talking about in terms of dangers and assaults on our democracy today, such as calling the press the enemy of the people, things like that, the terrible moral transgression of ripping children out of their parents' arms who are here seeking legal asylum. This is not a left versus right issue, ladies and gentlemen. This is not, and we should not let that idea distract us from what is going on. If you're a Republican, just work to get the soul back in the Republican Party. And if you're a Democrat, work to get the soul back in the Democratic Party. So the issue is our inability to listen to each other is such that, you know, it's a principle in nonviolence that the end, as Gandhi said, the end is inherent in the means. And Dr. King said you have very little morally persuasive power with people who can feel your underlying contempt. You know, I have two girlfriends, close girlfriends, who are big Trump supporters. And with one of them, the best road has been to not discuss it. The other one, we've worked hard, I have to say. We've actually worked at this. And we've found our way to, we actually had about 5 minutes of conversation recently that went okay. But we've had to work on it because we both wanted to protect this relationship. But something happened a few months ago where she asked me if I would help on my social media to promote a skincare line she's involved with. And I thought, well, promoting skincare isn't exactly what I do on my Twitter or my Facebook page. But I thought, I know what I can do. I can do something on Instagram. And she sent me a picture of her with these bottles of skincare. And I wrote this little description that said, Alana and Alana voted for Trump and I didn't. And we don't agree on quite a few things now, but one thing we can all agree on is collagen. I thought that was kind of cute. And a few people who posted, they thought it was cute too, and how nice they're trying to protect their relationship. Well, not everybody thought it was cute. And some of the posts were so vicious. Some of the posts were so vicious against me for even associating with anyone for voting for Trump. So vicious against her and making assumptions, not just about me, but about her because she was a Trump supporter. You know, I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, a smug, self-righteous, intolerant left-winger is no less dangerous to the emotional fabric of this country than is a smug, self-righteous, intolerant right-winger. We have become a nation of bad listeners. And social media, first of all, everybody's so upset that everybody's lacking impulse control right now, which if you're not praying and you're not meditating, the chaos of this moment is just tearing everybody out of their center. And then with social media, you have the opportunity to tell everybody right now how you feel, right? And so we're laughing about these things, but it's actually a dangerous time for this very reason. And so for those of us who really want to be disruptors, it's not about I'm a disruptor, I'm on the left, or I'm a disruptor on the right. It's about our ability to hear each other in a deeper way. Many years ago, I was giving a talk in Sacramento, actually, here in California. And during the questions and answers, the topic of abortion came up. And my first thought, I remember, was let's get off this topic immediately. Because you can feel the psychic rip in the room when you go there. Instead, I heard in my head, we're here to heal. You don't heal a topic by avoiding the subject. You bring it up. And what I said to the room was that God doesn't need our press release. Your opinion is not what every moment is demanding. And that sometimes, you know, from a spiritual perspective, what we want to seek is an emptying of the mind. The Course in Miracles has been called the Christian Vedanta. You know what in the East is this Zen mind, beginner's mind, you empty the rice bowl presenting it to God, is the equivalent of a metaphysical interpretation of be ye as a little child in the New Testament. Because in the Course in Miracles it says a child knows that they don't know. And they are looking to someone older and wiser to tell them. So from a spiritual perspective, we all need to let go on a certain level our opinions to first be in that space of divine neutrality. The Course in